Okay, so you want to own a champagne house. Rolling chalk hillsides outside Reims, your name on a label people save for anniversaries. A cellar cut into limestone where your own bottles age in the dark while you sleep. You've had the good vintage at a wedding, felt the weight of the bottle and thought, this isn't a business, this is inherited taste with a vineyard attached. And you're not entirely wrong. Champagne is one of the most protected, most profitable luxury categories on earth. There is just one problem. The house you're picturing isn't the house you're about to build, because before a single cork gets pulled, you're going to run into a region that has spent 300 years designing itself so that almost nobody new gets in. Let's talk about what that actually costs, and what's left once the land, the law, and your own patience get paid. Before the money, we need to talk about what a champagne house actually is, because the word covers several very different businesses. A recultant manipulant, an RM on the label, is a grower who farms their own vines and bottles under their own name. A negociant manipulant, an ME, buys grapes or juice from other growers, and blends them into a house style, which is what most of the famous names actually are. A cooperative manipulant pools grapes from many small growers into a shared label. And then there is the Grande Marque, the conglomerate house, which behaves less like a farm, and more like a luxury goods company that happens to own vineyards. These are not the same business. A 5-hectare grower, bottling 1500 bottles a year and a house shipping 30 million bottles a year are both champagne houses. They share an appellation and a region. They do not share an economic reality, the number that sounds big but gets bigger. Say you want land, real Champagne appellation land, not a vineyard somewhere else with bubbles in the name. As of 2024, the average price for a hectare of AOC Champagne vineyard was €1,121,800, and that average is hiding enormous variance. In the OB, the region's cheaper edge, you're looking at roughly €950,000 per hour hectare. In the Côte des Blancs, the most prized strip of Chardonnay land in the world, prices sit above €1.6 million per hour hectare. And in 2025 that figure climbed again to €1.69 million. Champagne covers roughly 34,000 hectares total. About 8% of France's vineyard area. Yet it represents over half the total value of every AOP vineyard in the entire country. That is not a typo. 8% of the land, 51% of the money. Do the math on a modest 10-hectare estate. Enough to produce a real sellable range under your own name, and you are looking at 10 to 17 million euros for dirt alone, before a single vine is pruned, before a single press is bought. And here's the part that catches new buyers off guard even harder than the sticker. Price. You almost certainly cannot buy it. 90% of Champagne's vineyard land is held by more than 19,000 smallholder growers with an average plot of just 2 hectares each. Land that has been in the same families for generations and rarely comes up for sale. When it does, French inheritance and land laws, plus a regional body called the SAFER that has right of first refusal on agricultural land sales, mean you don't simply write a check and close in 30 days. You wait, you compete, and often you don't win. And here's where families, who already own the land, can get destroyed by the very prices that are supposed to make them rich. When a grower dies, French inheritance tax is calculated on the vineyard's market value, which in Champagne now averages over €1 million a hectare. A family sitting on 5 hectares can be handed a tax bill in the high 6 or low 7 figures, on wealth that is chalk and vine roots, not cash. The grapes those vines produce, sold at regulated prices, could never generate that kind of money in a single year. So the heirs do the only thing they can. They sell off a sliver of the family plot, sometimes to a neighbor, sometimes to a house, circling for exactly this moment, just to pay the tax on the part they keep. 3 generations of patient ownership, fragmented in a single afternoon at a notary's office, because the land became too valuable for the family that owns it to actually afford it. Let's say you clear that hurdle, you have land, or you've decided to be a negociant and buy grapes instead of growing them, which is what most houses actually do. Now you need the plant. A proper press house, because Champagne regulation requires pressing to happen in specific, gentle ways that preserve delicate juice, runs into the hundreds of thousands of euros on its own. You need cellars, ideally the chalk pits under Reims and Epernay that hold a natural year-round temperature of around 11 degrees Celsius, because that stability is what makes slow secondary fermentation possible in the first place. You need riddling racks or gyro pallets to move sediment into the neck of each bottle, a disgorgement line to remove it, corking and wire caging equipment, and label and packaging capacity that can match the prestige your price point demands. Even a modest operation is looking at another $500,000 to several million euros before the first bottle is finished. Now here's the part that makes champagne a genuinely different animal from almost any other alcohol business. You cannot sell what you just made. French and EU regulation requires non-vintage champagne to age on its lees for a minimum of 15 months before release, and vintage champagne for a minimum of 3 years. And the serious houses hold their best cuvées far longer than the legal floor. Sometimes 5, 8, or 10 years. That means every euro you spent on grapes, labor, bottles, corks, and cellar space in year 1 sits completely frozen, earning nothing for years, while your bills keep arriving monthly. A rancher waits for a calf to fatten. You're waiting for a bottle to finish becoming itself. And there is no shortcut, because the law and the wine chemistry both refuse to be rushed. This is where undercapitalized new houses get destroyed. And it happens quietly. Years after the mistake was actually made, you borrow to buy grapes and build cellar capacity in a strong vintage year, betting that demand 3 to 8 years from now will look like demand does today. Then the market shifts while your wine is asleep in the cellar, obeying the law, earning nothing. The debt payments on the loan you took to make that wine don't pause for 15 months. They're due monthly, starting immediately. Plenty of small houses have gone under not because their champagne was bad, but because the bottles sitting in the cellar, the ones that were supposed to become revenue, simply weren't allowed to be sold yet when the loan payment came due. The operating costs, the bills that arrive every single day. Every grape used in champagne must, by regulation, be picked by hand, not by machine, which makes the harvest one of the most labor-intensive 3 weeks in all of agriculture. Grape prices in Champagne run higher than almost anywhere else on Earth, with top-tier Grand Cru fruit selling for more than €6 per kilogram in recent vintages. Since a 75-centimeter bottle requires roughly 1.2 kilograms of grapes, the raw grape cost alone for a single bottle of Grand Cru Champagne can run over €7 before you've added a bottle, a cork, a label, aging costs, labor, or a single euro of margin. And you don't get to decide how much you're allowed to grow. Each year, the Comite Champagne, the body jointly run by growers and houses, sets an official yield limit for the entire region. For the 2025 harvest, that limit was set at just 9,000 kilograms per hour, hectare, the lowest cap this century outside the pandemic year, producing roughly 255 million bottles against a sales forecast of around 270 million. Meaning the region has to draw down its own reserves just to meet demand. 2 years earlier, the cap was 30% higher. You are not simply running a farm. You are running a farm where a regional committee, not you, decides how much of your own land you're permitted to harvest this year, based on how much unsold wine is sitting in everyone else's cellars. This is not a hypothetical. In the spring of 2020, champagne shipments were projected to collapse by around 100 million bottles for the year. Roughly a third of the entire region's normal output, as the pandemic shut down every restaurant, wedding, and celebration on Earth simultaneously. Houses and growers who had spent the previous decade expanding, planting more vines, building bigger cellars, borrowing against future demand, suddenly had cellars full of wine that was legally still years from being sellable, and a market that had, overnight, mostly stopped buying. The Comite slashed the harvest cap to just 8,000 kilograms per hour hectare, the lowest limit in decades, simply to stop the region from digging the hole any deeper. That single decision meant thinner harvests and thinner reserve stocks for years afterward. People who had built their whole plan around steadily rising demand watched that assumption disappear in a single quarter, with years of frozen inventory in the cellar, and no way to convert any of it to cash any faster. Then there is weather, which in Champagne is not a seasonal inconvenience, it's an existential one. This far north, spring frost can wipe out a year's buds in a single cold night, hail can shred a crop in 20 minutes, and a wet, gray summer can leave you with underripe fruit that never gets the sugar levels the appellation requires. Unlike a rancher who can at least buy hay to get through a bad year, there is no substitute input for a champagne house when the frost hits in April. You simply have less crop, and there is no market on Earth that will sell you more legal champagne appellation grapes on short notice, because there aren't any to buy. Look at what actually happened in 2021. 12 straight days of frost between early April and early May hit the region right as the buds were breaking, followed by weeks of rain that triggered a mildew outbreak, then hailstorms that wiped out entire parcels. By the time picking started in September, The region had lost close to 60% of its natural yield, the smallest harvest in 40 years. In some individual vineyards, growers lost as much as 80% of their crop in a single season, through no fault of their own, with no way to hedge it and no insurance policy that makes a vine produce grapes that froze on the vine in April. And this isn't ancient history. In April 2026, 3 more nights of hard frost hit the region again, damaging an estimated 38% of the buds across Champagne, the second worst frost event since 2003. Every grower and house in the Appalachians spent that week doing the same math. How much of this year's income just froze overnight, and there was nothing anyone could do about it except watch the thermometer. Here's the part that breaks people's brains. When you picture the champagne industry, you picture Moet, Veuve Clicquot, Dom Perignon, Krug. Names with 300 years of mystique behind them. What you're actually looking at, almost every time, is one company. LVMH, the French luxury conglomerate that also owns Louis Vuitton and Dior, owns Moet and Chandon, Dom Perignon, Veuve Clicquot, Krug, Ruinart, and Mercier, all under one roof. Moet and Chandon alone ships around 30 million bottles a year, Veuve Clicquot, another 12 million, and together LVMH's champagne houses account for roughly 22% of all champagne sold on the planet. Brand Finance's most recent luxury wine rankings found that LVMH owns all 4 of the most valuable wine brands in the entire world: Moet, Chandon, Veuve Clicquot, and Dom Perignon, occupying 1st through 4th place simultaneously. And it isn't just LVMH. Across the whole appellation, the 100 largest houses account for more than 2/3 of total sales volume and 85% of exports, and the 6 largest conglomerate groups were responsible for 75% of the region's entire turnover in 2024. Meanwhile, the people who actually grow the grapes, more than 19,000 individual families, farming 88 to 90% of the vineyard land, sell roughly 2/3 of their harvest to those same large houses, because farming the grapes and selling the finished, branded bottle to the world, have become almost entirely separate businesses. You can own the dirt and still not own the industry built on top of it. And this is exactly how small houses disappear. A frost year cuts your harvest, a soft market delays your revenue, your seller financing comes due anyway, and suddenly the family that has run a house for 3 generations is sitting across a table from a buyer, backed by one of the 6 conglomerates that already control 75% of the region's turnover. The offer isn't hostile. It's often the only offer on the table. The name on the label survives. The independence behind it does not. This is how a region with 19,000 individual growers ends up with 2/3 of its total sales volume running through just 100 houses. Meet Elise. Not a specific person, an archetype, because there is a genuine repeatable path to building wealth in Champagne, and it almost never starts with someone buying a grand estate outright. It starts with a family that has farmed 2 or 3 hectares for 3 generations, selling their grapes every year to a big house for a fair, regulated price, and banking the difference. Elise's grandfather sold fruit. Her father sold fruit and started holding back a small percentage to bottles, under the family name once regulation allowed it, selling those bottles directly to restaurants and collectors, at a far higher margin than the grape price ever paid. Elise took over, converted the whole domain to recultant manipulant status, and now sells fewer than 20,000 bottles a year, entirely under her own label, at prices that dwarf what the grapes alone would have fetched. She never had to buy the €10 million estate, because she inherited it, slowly, across decades, the same way most real champagne wealth actually gets built. That's the pattern. Not a single glamorous purchase, but a small plot, held for generations, gradually converted from raw material supplier into finished luxury brand. There is one more variable that has nothing to do with grapes or weather at all: where your customers live. The United States is one of Champagne's largest export markets, and in 2025, trade talks between Washington and Brussels failed to secure an exemption, leaving European wine, Champagne included, subject to a 15% U.S. tariff. A house that built its business plan around American demand watched its effective price to us importers jump overnight, on wine that had already been aging, already been paid for, already committed to a price point, years before the tariff was ever announced. You cannot reprice a bottle that's been sitting in a cellar since a different president was in office. You just absorb it, or your importer does, or the bottle simply doesn't sell. The 2 scenarios: the good year you have a mid-sized negociant house, 10 hectares of owned vines plus grape contracts with neighboring growers, releasing 80,000 bottles a year at an average wholesale price of €28. Harvest is generous within the regulated cap, quality is strong, and demand holds. Gross revenue lands around 22 million euros, and after grape costs, aging losses, labor, packaging, and the slow bleed of seller financing, you clear a real, healthy margin, the kind that makes the whole enterprise look effortless from the outside. The bad year, an April frost cuts your usable harvest by a third, the Kemite trims the regional yield cap again to manage a region-wide glut, and 2 vintages you laid down years ago are only now hitting a market that has cooled since you priced them. Your grape costs per usable kilogram spike, because scarcity doesn't discount. Your revenue this year reflects decisions and prices set 3 to 8 years ago, not today's costs. And the gap between what left your bank account this January and what you're allowed to sell this September can run into hundreds of euros. The land didn't move. The brand didn't move. The weather and the committee did. So let's close the loop. You invest 10 to 17 million euros in real champagne land, assuming you can even find someone willing to sell it to you, plus another million or more in press house, cellars, and bottling equipment. And then you wait, by law, a minimum of 15 months to 3 years, before you're allowed to sell the first thing you made. Every grape is picked by hand. Every year's harvest is capped by a regional committee, based on everyone else's unsold inventory, and a single spring frost can undo a year's income overnight. Meanwhile, one French luxury conglomerate alone accounts for roughly a fifth of everything the region sells, and owns the 4 most valuable wine brand names on the planet outright. The chalk cellar under Reims, the family name on the label, the bottle opened at someone's wedding 20 years from now, that's not really a wine business. It's a multi-decade compounding machine disguised as agriculture, and the people who win at it are almost never the ones who bought their way in fast. They're the ones whose grandfather planted the vines, and who were patient enough to still be standing in the cellar when the wait finally paid off.